I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as a day of mourning is announced in Kyiv after a severe night's bombardment, leaving at least 16 dead and over 100 injured, we consider Moscow's demands that Ukraine destroy all its Western weaponry and further ramifications of the Israel-Iran crisis for the war. Then we take you to the Black Sea Forum in Odessa, hearing the first interviews we recorded there and describing some of the sights that greeted us when crossing the border.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Tuesday, the 17th of June, 3 years and 114 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by our Associate Editor of Defence, Dominic Nicholls, who starts by providing the latest news on the military situation.
Yeah, thanks, Francis. So Kyiv is recovering this morning after an almost 9-hour-long attack by hundreds of drones and missiles overnight. We are told there's 18 dead, over 100 injured. Those numbers have been ticking up all morning. At least 8 districts of the capital were hit. One of the dead was a 62-year-old US citizen. So whether or not that will have any impact, we'll wait to see. Ukraine's Air Force said Russia launched 472 aerial weapons overnight, including nearly 280 Shahed attack drones, 2 Kinzhal ballistic missiles and other cruise missiles. The strike primarily targeted Kyiv, but there were deaths and injuries elsewhere, including in Odessa and Zaporizhia. Ukraine's air defences said they shot down 428 air targets, including 239 of the drones, 15 Kh-101 cruise missiles and 1 of the Kinzhal ballistic missiles. President Zelensky called the assault one of the most horrifying attacks on Kyiv. In a statement on social media, he said, "Such attacks are pure terrorism, and the whole world, the US and Europe, must finally respond as civilised societies respond to terrorists." Mayor Vitaly Klitschko said cluster munitions had been found in one area of the city, and he said tomorrow would be an official day of mourning in Kyiv. Ukraine's State Emergency Service said many of the deaths and injuries occurred when a Russian missile hit a 9-storey residential building in the Solomyansky district, completely destroying one section. That's on the western side of the city centre. It's got the main train station at the sort of northern point of that district. Olena Kusharinova, a 46-year-old nurse who lives in a neighbouring building to the one that was hit, speaking to the Kyiv Independent, said, "I saw the missile because it was low. I grabbed my daughter by the hand and shouted, 'Run.' It was literally 15 seconds. We ran to the toilet and then there was a very powerful explosion." There's heartbreaking footage on social media that you'll find said to be of a couple waiting for their son's body to be recovered from under the rubble. Other footage shows Shahed drones flying into the apartment blocks. I've just retweeted one of them myself. As freelance journalist Alex Rafoglu said on Twitter, "We're old enough to remember what we used to call this on September 2001. Foreign Minister Andrei Sybiha also condemned the attack, calling it a massive and brutal strike timed deliberately to coincide with the G7 summit. He said Putin does this on purpose. He sends a signal of total disrespect to the United States and other partners who have called for an end to the killing. Only strong steps and real pressure on Moscow can prove him wrong." Now, I've been trying to ring the Russian embassy here all morning in London to ask about the attack, but every time my call was disconnected. However, Matthias Shimal, who's the humanitarian coordinator for Ukraine from the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, he strongly condemned the attacks and named Russia as the perpetrator. In a statement, he said, "Ukrainians have endured another night of violence. The residents of Kyiv have experienced terrifying drone and missile strikes by the armed forces of the Russian Federation. In Odessa, strikes reportedly caused multiple civilian injuries, also damaging a kindergarten and a centre for children with special needs, places where children should feel safe. In Zaporizhia, attacks damaged residential buildings, terrorising families in their own homes. Local first responders, local authorities and humanitarian workers are already on the ground supporting affected families, providing emergency medical care and delivering essential supplies while assessing further needs. Mr. Shmuel carries on. He says the people of Ukraine should not have to cower. I think he means cower. He said cover in shelters night after night. I don't know if he means cower or should not have to seek cover in shelters night after night. Each day, the war takes a devastating toll on civilians. Attacks on civilians and civil infrastructure are prohibited under international humanitarian law. Civilians, including children, must never be a target. We must not normalise the war. Thank you for those words, Mr. Shmuel. Well done to the UN there. I'm often a critic of the UN, but not afraid to give them a shout out when they do actually make comments. Now, asked by reporters for his reaction to the attacks on Air Force One, a clearly very surprised Donald Trump, who clearly hadn't been briefed on the news, said, "I'll have to look at it." Elsewhere on the ground, next to no movement on the ground, very minor adjustments in the vicinity of Sumy, to the southwest of Pokrovsk, carrying on the repeated motion of the last few weeks. I'm only mentioning that because even when a few hundred metres of ground is taken by Russia and I say no movement in the last 24 hours, I get a load of grief. So, there has been some movement, but next to nothing. Into Russia then, an independent media outlet Astra reported yesterday that the Nevromysk Azot chemical plant, that's one of Russia's largest producers of nitrogen fertilizer and ammonia and a key supplier to the Russian military, has suspended production as a direct result of Ukrainian drone strikes. Andrei Kovlenko, the head of Ukraine's Centre for Countering Disinformation at the National Security and Defence Council, said the plant, this is about 300 kilometres east of the Kerch Bridge, the plant produces up to 1 million tonnes of ammonia and over 1 million tonnes of ammonium nitrate annually. He said it's a critical element of Russia's military-industrial complex. Elsewhere, Ukrainian Defence Minister Rustam Umerov said yesterday that 1,245 bodies had been repatriated to Ukraine. That takes the total to 6,000 in this latest round of such activity. And this was the final stage of the plans that were sorted out under that Istanbul framework for repatriations of those that had been killed in action. Came out of that meeting on June the 2nd. Although they had arranged a window for repatriations to occur, and that window doesn't close until June the 20th. So there is still time, clearly, for another exchange, but I don't think any are being planned at the moment. President Zelensky said yesterday that Russia proposed exchanging kidnapped Ukrainian children held in Russia for Russian prisoners of war held in Ukraine. I'll say that again. I'm going to say that again because it is quite extraordinary. President Zelensky said yesterday that Russia had proposed exchanging kidnapped Ukrainian children held in Russia for Russian prisoners of war held in Ukraine. President Zelensky emphasised that is beyond humanitarian law. And just finally, Francis, I'll point people to an article by our friend and colleague Joe Barnes. It's in today's paper. You find it online. He says Russia has made fresh demands for Ukraine to destroy all of its Western weaponry as the price of peace. Alexander Grushko, who's a Russian deputy foreign minister, said all these surpluses must be destroyed. All international algorithms are known. They must be reduced, disposed of and guaranteed. His ultimatum is the latest in a series of maximalist demands tabled by Moscow, building on their the success of their demands so far, that Kyiv cuts the size of its armed forces, withdraws its troops from the 4 partly occupied eastern regions, recognises Moscow's illegal annexation of Crimea, and agrees never to join NATO or host any foreign troops on its territory. All of that before any ceasefire can be agreed, and clearly that's all working well for the Russians. Now, the Russian, you'll remember, and the Soviet negotiating strategy is to demand the maximum, if not more, whine that the other side is being unfair and very mean, and then keep shifting the goalposts. So this latest demand absolutely fits into that kind of strategy. Obviously, there's been no word from Russia about the 30-day ceasefire proposed by Washington and Kyiv. That's the one that Donald Trump seemed so keen about a few weeks ago before he lost interest. And unsurprisingly, Ukrainian officials have described the Russian requests as unacceptable. Joe says that Mr. Grushko's comments can be seen as an effort to curtail any future sales of high-end hardware to Ukraine. Mr. Grushko claimed, without citing any evidence whatsoever, that corrupt Ukrainian officials were selling donated Western weapons on the black market. He said, "It's crazy how reckless some politicians are, still flooding the market with weapons." So Operation Kick the Can Down the Road and divert Donald Trump away from his comments about taking 2 weeks to decide if Putin was tapping him along continues.
Well, thanks very much, Dom. Let's stick with Mr. Trump, whose attendance at the G7 summit was dramatically cut short yesterday as the president flew back to Washington early to handle the ongoing conflict between Israel and Iran, telling everyone to evacuate Iran's capital immediately. Now, Roland Oliphant, of course, co-host of our sister podcast Battle Lines, is monitoring this closely. But for our purposes on Ukraine the Latest, there is another consideration worth mentioning further to those we discussed yesterday and on Friday, namely the tensions at the heart of the Iranian regime with regard to Russia. Back in March, our Defence and Foreign Affairs editor Con Cochlin, who you'll recall I interviewed about Bashar al-Assad when his regime collapsed, wrote an exclusive piece which revealed one of Tehran's most high-ranking officials, Mohammad Javad Zarif, the former Iranian foreign minister who negotiated his country's nuclear deal, was ousted from his position as vice president because of the deepening rift between moderates and hardliners over Iran's continued support for Russia. He was opposed to Iran's ties with Moscow and the regime's military support for Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Some in Iran advocated for a nuclear deal to be struck and saw their relationship with the Kremlin as an impediment to progress on that front, further increasing rather than decreasing tensions with the West. Given the events of recent days, their perspective may have been vindicated, and we should keep a close eye to developments between the Iranian and Moscow delegates, politicians, and indeed presidents as a consequence of what we've seen. And of course, it doesn't seem to be any closer to stopping as we're recording this. Now, another consequence of the Israel-Iran crisis, specifically seeing Iranian missiles being shot down by Israel's allies, is that it has renewed the frustration, even anger, in Ukraine, that Kyiv's allies will not consider doing the same for Russian drones and missiles targeting civilian areas as today, a subject we have discussed many, many times. Now, there continues to be no hint of a shift by Trump on these bombardments by Moscow, as Dom says, quite the reverse. Speaking to the media alongside Mark Carney yesterday, he said, "Putin speaks to me, he doesn't speak to anybody else because he was very insulted when he got thrown out of the G8. Trump then said that was a mistake. In addition, as Reuters report, the Trump administration has shelved in recent weeks the interagency working group it had set up to formulate strategies for pressuring Russia into speeding up peace talks with Ukraine. That comes from 3 US officials who spoke to them. The effort, which was established earlier in the spring, lost steam in May, says Reuters, as it became increasingly clear to participants that Trump was not interested in adopting a more confrontational stance toward Moscow. So there it is, plain as day. And we will, of course, link to that piece and all of the others that we reference today. In other news, President Zelensky was in Vienna, Austria yesterday, meeting his counterpart Alexander Van der Bellen, signing documents on bilateral cooperation between the two countries. Now, at the joint press conference, Zelensky said that the agreements covered key areas, including agriculture, reconstruction, and the return of abducted Ukrainian children from Russia, though we haven't yet seen the full details. Zelensky said, "We are counting on Austria's support, both at the state and societal levels, on a sensitive issue for Ukraine. The presence of former Ukrainian officials and oligarchs," I believe he must have meant Russian there, "former Russian officials and oligarchs who are evading justice by hiding in Europe, including Austria, and concealing stolen assets." He then flew on to Canada for the G7, which he was invited to attend today. Now, speaking of Zelensky, there's been another poll published by the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology, which has shown a dip in popularity for President Zelensky from those highs he experienced after the Oval Office encounter and the minerals deal being signed. The survey found that 65% of Ukrainians currently trust the president, while 30% do not, yielding a trust balance of plus 35%. That is the lowest recorded since March, although remains above the February 2025 low of 57%. As the Kyiv Independent writes, the poll shows a stark regional divide. Trust is highest in western Ukraine at 73%, while in the country's south and east, areas more frequently targeted by strikes, only 61% express confidence in the president. The data also shows a sharp contrast in attitudes toward territorial concessions. Among those who trust Zelensky, 55% are strongly opposed to any such compromise. Among those who distrust him, 46% are willing to cede some territory, while only 43% are firmly against concessions. Now, that survey was conducted between May 15th and June 3rd using a random sample of 1,111 adult residents across Ukraine, excluding the occupied territories. Respondents were interviewed by phone. The last story I want to talk about, though, best analysed in the Times of London, looks into a recent document signed by more than 100 politicians in the Social Democratic Party of Germany. That's Olaf Scholz's old party, appealing for negotiations with the Putin regime over the establishment of a new peace and security order for Europe and a gradual return to détente and cooperation with Russia. Now, one of the names who signed that is Ralph Stegner, who in the middle of April, says the Times, 3 weeks before the end of Scholz's chancellorship, joined a delegation from Germany which flew out to Baku in Azerbaijan for a series of clandestine meetings with Russian officials, mingling with Putin's top human rights and civil society administrator, his international culture envoy, and Viktor Zubkov, the octogenarian former prime minister who chairs Gazprom, that state-owned gas conglomerate. Now, if that wasn't remarkable enough, Stegner was a member of the Bundestag's Intelligence Committee, so privy to some of his country's most sensitive state secrets. The Times goes on. For 20 years, these gatherings, known as the Petersberg Dialogues, had been a symbol of Berlin's special relationship with Moscow and an opportunity for the Russia sympathisers in the German elite to expand their business card collections and their inside knowledge of the Kremlin. These cosy ties were supposed to have been consigned to the past after Putin's full-scale invasion. Yet old habits, it seems, are a hard thing to break. Now, the document signed by Stegner and over 100 others says that instead of spending 3.5% of GDP on rearmament, Germany should be pursuing disarmament, renouncing escalation, and ploughing the extra hundreds of billions of euros of public borrowing into the struggles against poverty and climate change. This is no time for the one-sided apportionment of blame against the Kremlin, it adds, but rather for a peace policy with the goal of common security, starting with a refusal to host any American missiles on German soil. The Times concludes, alongside Stegner, the authors of the manifesto include Rolf Mützenich, who was until a few months ago the SPD's leader in the Bundestag and one of the most influential power brokers in the Scholz administration. He was also joined by the party's joint national leader until 2021 and Nina Scheer, its lead MP on energy policy. Now, this manifesto is a frontal attack not only on Merz, but also on the coalition partners in the SPD leadership. However, says the Times, it is not yet clear that the manifesto represents much more than the swan song of a pacifist faction in the SPD that now finds itself marginalised from the coalition and struggling for relevance. So a very interesting story indeed. It speaks to, of course, the tensions in Germany's political elite, a subject our Berlin correspondent James Rothwell has raised many times on this podcast. These figures may now be on the outside, as it were, but they are still there, they are still active, and it will be for posterity to judge just how influential these individuals were during the first 3 years of this war in the decisions made by Olaf Scholz's government. So those are the major political developments, but let's now take you back to Odessa. When we returned from our trip, we played the sounds we captured during a typical aerial attack on the city. Today, though, we want to take you back to our very first day when we were at the Black Sea Security Forum, sharing with you the first couple of interviews we recorded there. Dom picks up from the moment we crossed into Ukraine during the 4-hour drive from Chisinau, the capital of Moldova.
So we're in Moldova. Now we're in Ukraine. Back into Ukraine through the border post, and we're in Ukraine again. Pretty busy at the border checkpoint. Few cars on the Moldovan side getting through. Quite a big queue on the Ukrainian side. Lots of trucks. Seemed to take quite a while. We managed to get through quite quickly. We were allowed to use the fast track lane. We got through in about 20 minutes or so, and now we're back in Ukraine. Green fields either side, blue sky above, 20 degrees. Lovely day, but that belies what's happening underneath. So we've just gone through a military checkpoint, just a K or so inside the border. This is to check the occupants of the car, see who's who, see if there's any, see if people are able to move where they're trying to move. If there are men of fighting age trying to get out of Ukraine, there were some questions asked, and for us going in, they just want to see who we are, what we're doing here. We pass with flying colours. Just passing another military post here. Pillboxes on either side. The hedgehog structures, those sort of pyramid-shaped metal structures, pushed to one side. They can be brought onto the road very quickly. They'll stop an armoured vehicle, but they've been pushed to one side, so we got through that pretty swiftly. We just passed an electricity substation by the look of it, and there was an air defence vehicle moving along around the edge. Looked to me like a Gepard, the German Gepard armoured vehicle. Tracks, twin 25mm barrels either side, obviously protecting the site. Not in action, thankfully. So we've passed a lot of fruit sellers by the side of the road here, a lot of strawberries. It's strawberry season right now, but we also saw some pomegranates in there. Took us back to the pod we did a couple of weeks ago when we were making coffee with our new Ukrainian coffee making chum, and we were making the flat reds, which is strong espresso coffee and pomegranate juice instead of milk. It was an acquired taste, but very nice. So we're just on the outskirts of Odessa in the southwest of the city, and it's quite busy. A lot of life going on, but there's signs of war everywhere, adverts on the wall, and in the windows you can see. So it caught my eye. I thought they were Union flags at first, but no, that's actually tape to hold the windows together in case there's a blast outside. There's reminders of the war everywhere.
Well, after a 4-hour drive, we finally made it to Odessa. This is the city I've been most interested to see in Ukraine that we've not yet been to. Of course, a pivotal location on the Black Sea, not too far from Crimea. Played a vital role in the first year of the war, given its naval location, and is still under regular bombardments, and I'm sure that during our time here we will hear just that. Managed to survive on the way the rather excruciating small talk that Dom was trying to make with our very lovely driver who took us across the border. And over the next few days, I'm sure there's not only going to be more of that, but also some very interesting investigative pieces that we're going to do as well. So stay tuned. Odessa is a strategically vital port city, serving as a key hub for maritime trade, military logistics and grain exports, critical to both Ukraine's economy and global food security. Throughout the war, it's proved essential for maintaining Ukraine's access to the sea and resisting Russian efforts to isolate the country economically. With a pre-war population of around 1 million, it is Ukraine's third largest city and a crucial stronghold in the south, hence the creation of the Black Sea Security Forum, bringing together politicians and experts from both inside and outside the country. Hosted at the city's Grand Opera and Ballet Theatre, there was much excitement at the presence of Mike Pompeo, the US Secretary of State in Donald Trump's first term. Hence Dom hovering outside the hall, hoping to catch him.
Oh, are you not going to be listening to Pompeo?
Yeah, I'm trying to ambush him on the way in.
Sorry?
I'm trying to ambush him on the way in.
He hasn't come yet. It hasn't.
Well, I don't think so. We'll go in a second.
I need to chill and finish the coffee because apparently I can't bring it like inside.
There's been loads of drinks in there. I've seen loads of drinks. Francis has taken drinks.
I got told please don't do that because they will like struggle to clean it off basically because it's just black.
Well, maybe Francis managed to smuggle one past them, but
it's his charm. It's the glasses and the slick back. You know how many people behind your back were complimenting your hair?
Were they?
They were like saying, "Damn,
Right.
damn, he got it." So.
We'll play you some clips from Mr. Pompeo in a future episode. The forum began, though, with a minute's silence to those Ukrainians who've lost their lives in the war, before the opening remarks by its sponsor, Lord Ashcroft, international businessman, philanthropist, author, and a long-time supporter of Ukraine's cause.
Please be seated. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I hereby declare the Black Sea Security Forum open and invite our first speaker to the stage.
It is my great pleasure to be lead sponsor of this forum, to welcome you all to the beautiful city of Odessa, often described by residents as the Pearl by the Sea. And a pearl it is indeed, rich in history, shaped by a tapestry of cultures, and defined by the resilient, unmistakable Ukrainian spirit, not least its enduring sense of humour, even in the most trying of times. And today, as we gather here, Odessa finds itself on the front line of a very different kind of struggle. As the world navigates an era of growing fragmentation, the Black Sea has become a stage of global relevance. We are witnessing here the redefinition of maritime security itself. For the first time in history, a country with no conventional navy has succeeded in neutralizing and repelling a major sea power. Ukraine is not only defending itself, it is setting new precedents for how maritime power can be projected in the 21st century. The United Kingdom, with its proud naval tradition, has much to learn from Ukraine's example. So too do our European allies. To learn from Ukraine is not just to show solidarity. It is to equip ourselves for the realities of tomorrow's conflicts, which, given today's geopolitical climate, may not be far off.
After that introduction, I spoke to Lord Ashcroft about his motivations for sponsoring the forum. Well, Lord Ashcroft, thank you very, very much for your time. I know how extraordinarily busy you must be. Why do you think gatherings like this one are important, and especially outside of the capital, Kyiv?
Well, certainly supporting Ukraine in the fourth year of a full-scale war is more important than ever, and war fatigue is not in my vocabulary. And this is my 12th trip to Ukraine since February 2022, having visited many frontline cities and towns, for the second time sponsoring the Black Sea Security Forum here in Odessa. It is important for international policymakers and experts to visit Kyiv for high-level conversations and expressions of solidarity, but it's just as important to see the reality on the ground. And for discussion on maritime trade and security, being in Odessa, Ukraine's biggest operational seaport, is actually essential.
Well, in your latest piece for The Telegraph, you wrote this: only a settlement that secures Ukraine's sovereignty can bring lasting peace. Now, how do your reflections on history, you're the leading collector of Victoria Crosses, for instance, how does that inform your perspective on this war?
Well, I've always believed that those who have risked and sometimes given their lives, their ultimate sacrifice, carrying out courageous acts, must be remembered. And my father served as a young officer during the D-Day landings in June of 1944. And he told me what happened on that day, and that has shaped my commitment to commemorate and highlight the valor of those who have demonstrated exceptional bravery in the face of adversity. And that belief led me to establishing a gallery in the Imperial War Museum to house what is the world's largest collection of Victoria Crosses. And sadly, because of the museum's decision to close the gallery, the collection will only be on display, in fact, until the end of September. And I hope many people will take advantage of that and see it before it closes for a while.
It is an extraordinary gallery, and as I say, I highly, highly recommend that listeners do so. I remember doing it when it opened several years ago, and many of the stories really incredibly powerful that you have alongside the crosses that were given for the valour that you just described. So, no, I completely echo that.
Well, today, Ukraine exemplifies that same courage, fighting for freedom, independence, and what is right. And Britain once stood alone against tyranny, and we must now stand with Ukraine, helping it not only to survive, but, in fact, to thrive.
As a philanthropist, do you think enough has been done in terms of international support for Ukraine, even if just in a humanitarian context?
Well, as you know, Ukraine has received significant amount of aid from its Western partners, including from the UK. Unfortunately, given the scale of challenges it is facing, it's not nearly enough. And daily, Ukraine faces a barrage of missile and drone attacks, destroying its critical infrastructure and homes, and at the same time inflicting immense human suffering. And we must all do more to protect human lives and reduce suffering. And I believe that if each of us does what we can with what we have, it amounts to a big effort. And that's why I'm supporting the First Lady of Ukraine with several humanitarian projects focusing on rebuilding children's medical centers and recreational facilities. These are desperately difficult times for Ukraine, and I do urge everyone to do what they can to support the country in its hour of need.
Let's go back in time a little bit. When and why did you become so involved in championing the cause of Ukraine?
Well, I had visited Ukraine on a number of occasions, even before February 2022. I was a guest of the Ukraine military in 2018 and went to the frontline trenches in the Donbass. And so I got to know the country, and I liked its people. And at the time of the all-out invasion, Ukraine was the innocent victim of appalling aggression from a more powerful neighbor. So I quickly resolved that I'd do my bit to try to help Ukraine in its hour of need, and that's exactly what I've done now for more than 3 years.
Perhaps you could go into a little bit more detail of the specific ways in which you've worked these past few years for helping Ukraine.
Well, I try to help in two main ways. Firstly, I've written well over 40 articles for British newspapers and for the Ukrainian media too, highlighting the general cause of Ukraine in its war with Russia, and more specifically, the bravery of its people. And secondly, as a philanthropist, I've made significant contributions to Ukrainian charities and good causes, and that's notably the foundation set up by the First Lady to promote reconstruction in our homeland, particularly in the areas of healthcare, education, and humanitarian aid. And my view is very much that if a lot of people make a small contribution, then collectively we can achieve quite a lot for Ukraine.
Are you worried about President Trump's approach to Ukraine and his relationship with Putin?
Well, that's certainly an interesting question. You know, I think we all know that Donald Trump is a unique character with a unique chance to bring peace to Ukraine, but that would require decisive and robust actions especially if he wants to receive the much-coveted Nobel Peace Prize. Appeasement doesn't work with Putin, as he only respects power. And the United States is the only country amongst Western allies that has the power to force Putin to stop the war before militarily through more severe economic sanctions. And I don't know if you know, but the Sanctioning Russia Act introduced in Congress with strong bipartisan support could impose severe sanctions on Russia and its allied states that do support the war. If Putin fails to negotiate in good conscience, and letting the bill pass and signing it could be the first real step in getting Putin to listen.
Yes, that's the Lindsey Graham bill that we've talked about several times on the podcast, and we'll have to wait and see what happens with that. One final question, if I may, Lord Ashcroft. Should the UK, in your view, send troops as part of a peacekeeping force in the event of some kind of settlement?
I think there's a caveat here in that it has to be a united decision amongst the European allies, such as France, Germany, Poland, others, to send a coalition force into Ukraine, then yes, absolutely. One of the proudest moments of Britain's recent history was being the first European country to stand with Ukraine in its time of need, and we should not be stepping back now. Of course, the nature and mandate of that deployment still needs to be defined, and that could be tough. Unfortunately, the British Armed Forces don't have the readiness and the capacity to provide strong support for Ukraine. Hopefully, the Strategic Defence Review promised to come out within the next few weeks will address these critical gaps.
Later, after the initial panel discussions, I caught up with Kira Rudik, member of the Ukrainian parliament and the leader of Holos, another liberal pro-European party separate from President Zelensky's. You may recall we interviewed Kira when her home in Kyiv was badly damaged after a bombardment earlier in the war. Well, it's a pleasure to speak to you again, Ms. Rudik. Thank you very much for your time. I want to start, if I may, just by asking, what's the mood in the Ukrainian parliament at the moment?
Hello, and thank you so much for having me again. It's a pleasure. Well, we are all worried because every time you hear new American administration making any kind of statement, it's not only that we have to talk to our international colleagues. That's fine. We are standing for our country. But we are getting the calls from the front line where we have to explain to people who are fighting, who are risking their own lives, what's going on. Did the American position change entirely? Is the Europe still standing with us? Or like what's going on? And the main question is, would they have at some point weapons to fight, or are they going to face enemy empty-handed?
And I remember that we had you on the podcast not long after your own house had been hit by, I think it was a missile or a drone. I wonder, how have the recent attacks on Kyiv been? There have been some very severe ones in the past week or so.
So, thank God we were just able to rebuild recently my home. However, there are so many places in Kyiv that were not rebuilt and in Ukraine that were not rebuilt. One of the things that I want to direct to our listeners is that when we are talking about rebuilding of Ukraine, it's not about building some futuristic cities. It is just for people who lost their homes to be able to regain what they already have had and what they have worked for their whole life. Recently, there has been this massive attacks on Kyiv. It just seems that Russia keeps ramping up over and over their ability to attack. And it's very hard for us because it seems that there were so many, 17 packages of sanctions. The fact that Russia at this point is able still to manufacture drones and missiles means that sanctions obviously are not working. So every time when we are talking about the attacks on a very practical level, we need to be talking about, does Ukraine have enough of the air defense systems to defend the people? And then why does Russia still able to develop and manufacture those drones and missiles? And I think these are two very practical questions that we can work with our international partners on. First, of course, supplying more of air defense systems that would perhaps win some time for us to, and for new administration and different leaders to continue negotiating, etc., etc. But then saying, okay, maybe we should look deeper into the 17 packages of sanctions, because obviously they are not giving the result that they were supposed to.
Is there a sense among Ukrainian members of parliament that the nature of the attacks, when they start, when they stop, is in some way calibrated or shifts as a consequence of what Trump says about Putin? Because it seems that they suddenly stopped after he put a message out, or do you think it's coincidental?
It's really coincidental. I think Russia's, they had the plan since the beginning, and they just continue going with this plan. I think it's very naive from Western leaders to think that something that they say or do actually influences what Russia does. And if you look at it really pragmatically, that's the truth. They had their plans with attacks and they are going on with them. And for all these illusions that the West still has, we have to pay with the lives of our people. And this is such a terrifying feeling when you know that basically with your life you're winning time for some other people to do more talking.
We had a Ukrainian journalist on the podcast recently, and she'd been speaking to a lot of opposition members of parliament, and she was saying that there's a lot of frustration among some opposition members at the moment about the way in which they don't feel they're able to be part of the process in the parliament at the moment. Is that your sense? Is that your feeling?
Oh, of course, politicians are frustrated. Look, at the beginning of full-scale invasion, we made this vow, this agreement to work together as one, as Team Ukraine, until the war is over. Couple of things. Politicians are not set to work together. This is just against their nature. And of course it is frustrating and we would want to participate more in different decisions. But we also need to keep in mind one thing. It's a wartime. And we cannot have elections during wartime. We cannot have some rapid changes during the wartime, because honestly this unity is what have kept us up till this point. And if we go outside right now and grab anyone here on the street and ask him or her what are the top 10 things on your mind, I guarantee, I can bet you actually some money, I can guarantee you that politics will not be in their mind. And if you ask them what are the other 10 things, politics will not be there. So we need to concentrate on what people have elected us for, trying to keep the state going, getting as much help as possible, and then when the war will be over, then we can pull out our ambitions and have a political debate. But right now, it's really not the time.
I'm tempted to take you up on that offer, but I will resist. I wonder, just you mentioned elections there. You've already said that you don't think there can be any prospect of elections until martial law ends and until the war is over. But I wonder, do you get a sense in the Ukrainian parliament that elections could happen in the shorter term than perhaps some people might expect? Are you preparing?
No, we are not preparing, and the short answer is no. Actually, right now, in a couple of minutes, I'm going to be speaking on the panel about Romania and Moldova, and I think we were all out of breath, honestly, about how Romanian elections were going. And so when anybody is asking about elections, aside of all the other arguments that we have already discussed many times, security and participation of the military, etc., I would ask you one additional question. Do you think we have resources right now to contradict Russian influence that 100% will be there and that they will flow an enormous amount of resource into? I do not think so. Again, our concentration right now needs to be to get the air defense systems and to get the weapons into the hands of Ukrainian soldiers. If this is the thing that Ukrainian parliamentarians can do, this is what we should be doing. And this is what, honestly, we are concentrated on.
Were you surprised by the Romanian result? How influential and significant do you think that will be for Ukraine?
We exhaled, actually, because, at first we have heard, we have only Orban through the European leaders. Then we had Orban and Fico, who were actually openly saying that they're against Ukraine's support. And we were just thinking, would the European politics sustain if there will be 3 people, if there will be 4 leaders who will be standing against Ukraine? And we cannot afford that, honestly. And so we are very glad that Romanian people have chosen Europe and not something that's against Europe.
Well, I know you've got to dash to your panel, so one final question. Is there anything that you've not talked about with me now that you'd like to say to listeners?
We are so grateful to everyone and each and every person for supporting us and standing with us. This is something that I have seen in Britain nowhere else. And this is, again, something good that I can tell when I come back from the business trip, when our military are asking, so is the world remembering about us? Is the world standing with us? And I can honestly and open-heartedly say, yes, they are. And for that, I'm very grateful.
Well, thank you, Kira. Good luck on the panel, and I'm sure we will catch up again soon.
Thank you, and glory to Ukraine.
Later this week, you'll hear more familiar voices from the forum, as well as excerpts from discussions we also took part in. But that's just the beginning. Over the coming weeks, you'll be able to hear and watch our trip on the Black Sea with the Ukrainian Navy, our time with an anti-aircraft unit watching the skies for drones, our participation in a children's chess tournament. Yes, Dom and I do play a match. Plus visits to a prosthesis factory, a rehabilitation centre, and important sites in Odessan culture. And for those of you who are wondering, yes, I do watch Ukrainian daytime television again in my hotel room. So stay tuned. Dom, shall we go to our final thoughts? Where do you want to start?
Yeah, thanks, Francis. So I've been tracking the news. The casualties in Kyiv, it's 15 dead now, and it's gone up to 139 injured. So I said earlier on that there were 18 dead. That was across the whole country, Kyiv. So that number, I think I'd seen that elsewhere, 15 dead, but the number of injured has gone up in Kyiv, 139. That will, I think, keep ticking up through the day. But other than that, I just want to draw people's attention to our newsletter. So we've now started a weekly newsletter. Francis and I will put a link in the episode notes. It's an opportunity to offer a few more personal thoughts from us. I guess we top it with a comment or an update on something that we've been thinking about or looking at during the week that we haven't included on the podcast. And we've got some questions. We take it in turn. So I think it's me this week on the top bit. Then Francis will be answering some listener questions. And then at the bottom, there's a bit more of a personal section about other stuff we've been looking at, reading, watching, visiting, eating, drinking, what have you. So a bit more behind the Wizard of Oz curtain if you like. So please do sign up to the Ukraine the Latest newsletter. And as I say, we'll put the link in the episode notes. And do please continue to send your questions to us at ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every single question. I can assure you of that. It's just Francis, me and Natalie, but we do read the whole lot. We can't always reply to every single one, and we can't always answer them either in the newsletter or on air, but we do, I can assure you, read every single one.
Yeah, thanks to everybody who submits those questions. It's always so fascinating to read them. And if you can't include them on the podcast, then we'll include them, if we can, in the newsletter. But I just wanted to end with an interesting long read on the BBC called The First Trial of Its Kind. A Russia soldier takes the stand for an execution. It looks at the trial of a Russian charged with executing a Ukrainian prisoner of war. It's a very interesting read in terms of the process Ukrainian prosecutors are taking towards this issue, something, of course, we've discussed in the past. And the piece says their goal for this year and next is to bring cases against middle and higher level Russian command. According to the testimony from the captured Russian in this soldier's unit, their senior commander issued an order directly before the assault that no prisoners should be taken. For anyone interested in that subject, it's an essential read. It also made me think, in tandem with the terrible bombardments on Kyiv we've seen today, the old maxim that it's impossible to win a war against the very enemies created by your own actions. And one often hears still this refrain repeated that certain parts of Ukraine are sympathetic to Russia because they're Russian speakers. And it's one of those arguments that I'm sure many of you have had thrust upon you in conversations on this subject. Yet the reality is that, as we experienced in Odessa only a few weeks ago, that people who perhaps, I hesitate to use the word sympathetic, but saw themselves as having some kind of connection, sympathy, cultural understanding, family connected to Russia, their attitudes have profoundly changed, as one might expect, as a consequence of the constant horrific bombardments that they have suffered at the hands of Moscow. And so whenever you hear that argument, it's important to press home that attitudes shift, and there's no greater cause of attitude shifting than war and your own life being threatened by a hostile country. We've seen it throughout history. And so just something I think it's important to underscore in the context of some of the conversations one often hears. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Dom Nicholls and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Phil Atkins. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells, and David Nicholls.
My name is David Nicholls. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.